Hi, I'm Ted Pattison from Critical Path Training. We're here to prepare for certification exams for SharePoint development. In particular, we're going to prepare for exams 70, 573, and 70, 576. Now, as far as the exams go, the 573 exam targets technical specialists. The name of the exam is Microsoft SharePoint 2010 Application Development. The second exam is going to be harder. There's going to be a little bit more drill down, and it's targeting the professional developer, and that's 576. The title of that exam is Designing and Developing Microsoft SharePoint 2010 Applications. Now, both exams have the same format. There are 50 multiple choice questions. At the beginning of each test, just before it starts, you're asked to select either C# or VB.NET, and all code examples are shown to you in that particular language. For the first test, you have at least 90 minutes. There probably should be plenty of time. And there's another 30 minutes for the professional exam. Now, as far as the drill down of topics, we're going to spend time going through each one of these sections of each test. What I would recommend is that for the technical specialist test, you just look and review the slides that we've given you for 573. If you're going to take the 576 exam, we recommend going through both of these sessions, as the material that we're going to cover on 573 is also covered in 576. Now, in addition to these sessions, some other preparation resources you might find valuable is the textbook that I wrote with Andrew Connell, Scott Hillier, and David Mann, Inside Microsoft SharePoint 2010. And that's going to cover over 90% of what is on the test and go into a lot of detail about features, solutions, and the types of things that you can develop for SharePoint. And the ISBN number is 978-07-3562-7468. If you have the opportunity, another important resource would be to take training. If you take some hands-on training through my company, we have a SharePoint developer course targeting SharePoint 2020, the Great SharePoint Adventure, code GSA 2010. And if you're not able to go to a hands-on course, we have online training for 5 days, and that is a course titled Developing Solutions with SharePoint 2010. And you can see our complete schedule at http://criticalpathtraining.com. We'll start with the technical specialist test, 573. Now, if you look at the Microsoft website, it outlines the topics covered into these broad categories: working with the SharePoint user interface, developing web parts and controls, developing business logic, working with SharePoint data, stabilizing and deploying SharePoint components. So let's drill a little bit more into these areas. Well, first of all, let's go ahead and work through what type of questions might be under the category of working with SharePoint user interface. So you have to know how to manage SP site and SP web objects, in particular how to call dispose. They're going to ask about using the dialog framework, where you're using client-side JavaScript to bring up a dialog box. There's some questions on creating custom ribbon objects and also on customizing navigation. And then also there's 1 or 2 questions on applying branding and different strategies to do that. Now, if we start with a quick refresher of the server-side object model, there's objects that are created from classes such as SP Farm, SP Web Application, SP Site, SP Web. The SP Site and SP Web are particularly important. Now, there's this age-old problem in SharePoint when a developer calls new on an SP site object to create an object that wraps a site collection. And the issue is that you have to call dispose on any type of SP site object that you've called new on. If you don't do that, you leave the object stranded in memory, and it takes up a pretty big footprint. And so that's one of the well-known issues that causes instabilization and performance issues in production code. Now, if we look at the top block, typically what we do is our call to dispose can be made implicitly because we create the SP site object inside of a using construct. Now, if you look at the code below, what not many developers do explicitly is to put calls to dispose inside of a try finally block. However, when you use a using statement, the compiler expands the code that you see in the top to something similar to what you see on the bottom. So inside the test, they're going to ask you about when you need to make things more efficient, add a call to dispose. But what they'll have is they'll have something in the try block where you're creating a new SP site, and then you'll have to put the call to dispose inside the finally block. So that's really what they're going to be testing on. Now, as far as dialogues go, there's a question that asks you about creating dialogues, and inside of the client-side JavaScript libraries, there's this special type, SPUI modal dialog, and it has a function called show modal dialog, and you can see that you create this JavaScript object, and then you go ahead and you fill it full of property values, give it a callback. So they're going to ask about how to create dialogues, and just know that there is the sp.ui modal dialog, and that allows you to have functions within that scope and call show modal dialog. Now, next thing we'll look at is adding navigation nodes. So here's an example where inside of a feature receiver, you can go ahead and create SP navigation node objects, and you could add them to either the top link bar or the quick launch bar. So one way that we could add these type of nodes is to do it programmatically through the object model. Some other options that we have is just creating custom actions, which is more of a declarative way to get a link or a menu command into the SharePoint user interface. And by adding custom actions, I can add links to the site settings page. I can add new menu items into the site actions menu, and I could add new menu items into something like the ECB, the edit control block menu for a document or list item. Now, there is also going to be some questions about extending the ribbon. How do you create a control or a group inside there? And the way that we do that is through XML. In particular, we have a custom action, but there's just a command UI extension element inside there. Now, nothing on the test drills down and requires your knowledge of the XML inside the command UI extension element, but just knowing that the custom action is the high-level element that we add to an element manifest to extend the ribbon is going to give you what you need for the test. Now, the next thing we'll look at is just a SharePoint site. It's just a collection of pages, and there is a single master page inside the site that all the pages link to. Now, we also want to differentiate between two different types of pages. There are site pages that exist inside the content database, at least they're tracked inside the content database, and they might render using a page template on the web front end, or they might render using a customized copy of a page that's been written into the content database. There's also application pages that are served out of the underscore layouts directory. So knowing the difference between those is important. And note that in SharePoint 2010, they've basically improved the infrastructure so the site pages and application pages can both look to a single master page in the master page gallery for the current site. Now, every single site has a master page gallery. And that means if you have a site collection, and your site collection has a top-level site and two child sites, well, then there's 3 master page galleries, one for each of those sites. And so one of the things that we see is that SharePoint for team sites and blank sites uses a new master page that was created especially for the new user interface in SharePoint 2010, which is v4.master. But now, if you have 3 sites in a site collection, each site has its own ghosted version of v4.master. And so there are some questions about how to do branding on a site collection-wide basis that typically involves creating a project with a feature, and the feature has a module. And so what you do is you use the module to create or provision an instance of your custom master page from a custom master page template, and you create that in the top-level site's master page gallery. And then you basically need to add a little code, or you don't have to write code if you use the publishing sites in SharePoint Server, but you can synchronize all the child sites to all link to the master page in the top-level site. So just basically knowing that the master page gallery is once per site, not once per site collection, but you can have a single master page in the top-level site that is used by all the different sites in the site collection. And then finally, knowing the technique of using a Visual Studio project and a feature and having a master page template allows you to create a branding scheme, on a farm-wide basis. You just have to activate the site collection feature in any site collection where you want to use it. Okay, moving on. Well, we're also going to have to know how to create web parts. And one particular thing that you need to know is that when it's time to override methods in your web part base class, one simple way is to override render contents. So don't override the render method, override the render contents method. And also, if you're going to create a web part that's a composite control, meaning it's going to create and manage its own child controls, then we override the create child controls method and create the child controls inside there. Now, there's also a question or two on web part connections. And the important thing to remember here is when you want to develop a web part pair that supports connections, you start by creating a .NET interface. Then in the provider web part, you implement that interface and you add a connection point method. As you see, there's the method that has the attribute connection provider. And then in the consumer web part, you consume that interface that you've created. And you can see that the consumer web part also has a connection point interface method. Now, there's also some questions on delegate controls. So if you're not familiar with a delegate control is typically a placeholder control that's defined inside of a master page. And all the built-in master pages, such as v4.master, have 7 or 8 delegate controls that are defined inside there. And the way the delegate controls work is that you create a feature and you say, here's my control, I'd like to substitute it into that delegate control that's defined on the master page. Now, there's a couple different questions on delegate controls, and several focus on the sequence number. But the idea is that, let's say that there is a placeholder control, like the one in v4.master, for the search box. Well, the way things work is that that delegate control can only take one control. But if you have multiple features that are all activated at the same time and they're all trying to substitute a control into that same delegate, the one with the lowest sequence number wins. And then the other pieces of information that are important for the test is that there is a SharePoint Foundation feature, a SharePoint Server Standard version feature, and a SharePoint Server Enterprise version feature that all substitute controls into the search box. And the one for SharePoint Foundation has a sequence number of 100. The one for SharePoint Server Standard has a sequence number of 50, and the one for the Enterprise version has a sequence number of 25. So if you want to guarantee that your search box would be substituted instead of the out-of-the-box ones, you would want a sequence number lower than 25.